Especially with Democrats coming into Congress and a lot of talk about who's running in 2020. Are people taking this Medicare for All thing seriously inside the healthcare industry? And would it be good for all the players involved, or is it silly to even talk about it because there's no way this would become a reality?
You know, what I would say is we should tie this back to the Texas court decision and the lawsuit. I think the Democrats now again have their own agenda back on the table. There's a burning platform. The Affordable Care Act is vulnerable, so they can come in with some legislative fixes. I really doubt they'll go all the way to Medicare for all. I think they'll contemplate it, but within the caucus, I don't think there's agreement on that.
But there's now some people saying, well, what about just Medicare for 55 and older? And look at Medicare Advantage and, you know, look at the insurers who are involved in that marketplace. What if they did something like that?
Whether they will actually come in with the complete public option, quote unquote, that Nancy Pelosi talks about is very, very doubtful in my view. I think it'll become a public-private partnership if it ever happens. I had said this once before, it's about $1 trillion in spend in the employer-sponsored market annually.
That's
now like 10 times what we had budgeted for the Affordable Care Act 8 years ago, and that was done on a budget-neutral basis. You know, they couldn't find the funding. We're talking about something of gigantic proportions.
Yeah, but they're talking about it.
Yeah, and so if it happens, it still will happen, I think, in partnership with the private insurers. I think they're so entrenched. They're so far ahead on clinical solutions.
But private insurers would be fine with, I mean, is the risk for them, if we start talking about single payer or Obamacare or anything, is the risk for them that, well, when there's one party to negotiate with, they get less money? Or is it just, look at what Obamacare's done. It's expanded access. It's been great for hospitals. Even when that ruling came out, they were the first places to sell off. So does this pose any kind of threat for the industry, or would this be great news?
The way you're painting it is exactly the public-private option that I'm talking about. I think, you know, in the minds of investors, some of them view this as they're completely disintermediated, and the government is going to run healthcare. Right. Well, CMS and HHS are not, you know, in my view, capable of doing what the insurers are doing. They're not staffed to do it or any of that.
And when is the latest appeals challenge to Obamacare? When does is it expected to hit SCOTUS? Will SCOTUS take it up?
2019 first to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
So when would it hit SCOTUS?
SCOTUS is 2020, assuming that the first appellate court still holds that court's decision.
Okay. And then Roberts, I think, I don't know. I think he doesn't. I don't know if he's looking at law or looking at overturning the public. Or, you know, I don't know whether he's willing to do it again. I think he might be a 5-4 against again.
That's what I would think, too. I mean, he could walk it back to just keeping the pre-existing condition provision and the community rated. Yeah. You know, the earlier judge has struck down that, and I think that might still hold potentially. There's really at least some logic to the non-severability of the mandate from those two provisions. Will they ever actually strike down Medicaid expansion? That would, I think, shock everybody. We have over 20 million people right now on health insurance across exchanges and Medicaid. You know, more like 28 million.
I mean, I understand the logic behind the taxing authority being gone, but Medicare Advantage,
Medicare Advantage is completely separate from this, so that one will remain the way it is. So there's no issue on that.
When California was going to do single payer, it was going to cost how much in California?
More money.
It was a number where there
no money for education.
Nothing was going to be. How much would it cost? It would only be $1 trillion to do.
$1 trillion is what employers, you know, between employers and what we all pay for out-of-pocket costs and
deductibles. So it'd be $1 trillion a year.
It's $1 trillion a year.
Like the tax was $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion over 10 years or something.
That was over 10 years at the time.
So this would be $1 trillion a year.
So it's like 10 times, we're talking about.
But wasn't it like $52 trillion over a 10-year period to pay for something like Medicare for all?
Yeah, it's something, I think it's probably less than 52, but, you know.
We're a wealthy country and we can do this. There would be
they said you have to double individual rates from what they currently are.
But we have people getting elected to Congress that say this with a straight face, and
the progressives will always say that. I think, you know, I mean, the Democratic agenda has always been to have a complete public option, and Medicare has been the only real federally funded public program, and even that's turning into Medicare Advantage, to your point.
Right, and so what now? You have all of the insurers, you have consolidation across the pharmaceutical space with the PBMs. What are people gearing up to do with all of this hanging over the space? What are they seeing for 2019 and 2020?
I think investors are overly concerned about just this Texas lawsuit and the ACA. If you look at the fundamental exposure, the large cap 5 insurers have less than 5% of their earnings coming from coverage expansion. In fact, if the taxes and the fees were overturned, it's a net positive. I would also say from the drug stock perspective, and I don't cover drugs, my colleagues cover it, but just from a broad sector standpoint, the focus is now moving away from drug pricing back to coverage expansion. Right. The growth in biopharma has not been from volume, it has been from pricing. So they do get a reprieve, if you will, from a policy standpoint at least. Competitive pressures aside,
they
but
might
from a policy
drug
standpoint.
pricing.
They're not trading that way. Merck, Lilly, Pfizer, they're all rallying sharply on the expectation that drug pricing reform is not going to be on the agenda.
Well, they have these defensive characteristics in an uncertain market, so they've been the best performers so far this year.
Absolutely. So I think, considering we are in a late cycle economy, the policy risk is overblown. I think healthcare can still work. The only 3 stocks that are meaningfully exposed in my own universe are Centene, Molina, and to a lesser extent, WellCare. Of course, we don't think Medicaid expansion will get overturned, but there is fundamental exposure.
Well, it doesn't have to get overturned. Could the states, and this is a longer-term issue, but once the cost is more shifted onto them, say we can no longer support this?
They could say that, yeah.
But then they'd have to, what would they do one by one? I mean, it's already...
You mean the states would say that? You're saying they can no longer support Medicaid expansion?
If they start to say, well, the cost of this now, as it gets shifted over time towards them, but...
Yeah, I mean, the margins in Medicaid have always been a concern that, over time as states face budget pressures and the size of that entitlement continues to grow, that the margins could compress. We are seeing a lot of consolidation, though. And, I think that was a point that one of you made. I think the consolidation drives margin expansion in the best case. At the very least, it's an offset to any kind of rate pressures you might see at the state level or at the federal level.
Do you think that the eventual nominee in 2020 is going to be a single-payer person that the Dems run? The reason I say a new alert... Apparently, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren taking a big step towards running for president. In an email to supporters, Warren said that she's announcing an exploratory committee to seek the presidency. Is she okay in terms of the way that whole Native American issue played out recently? I don't know whether that, because it brought the issue back, and everybody re-examined how her entire career and whether that was, it's hard to go back on it. You didn't know you were going to run for president when you were trying to get hired at Harvard, and suddenly it's all, historically in your record. And even Native American groups had a problem with I think, her take on what those tests proved, right? I mean, is she a viable candidate in your view?
I mean, if you look at the midterms, the candidates that really made it were those that had practical fixes to real problems. Medicaid expansion with ballot
But you're saying she's not one of those?
I think Medicare for All is trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, really.
Although, Anna, one thing, whether it be Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Beto O'Rourke, I mean, you are going to have some big populist arguments that are going to be coming from there, along with what we've heard from President Trump, which kind of echoes that. We may be abating on some of those concerns right now, but does that pick back up again next year?
I think there'll be headline risk, certainly, leading up to the election. When the new Congress takes effect, we'll start to hear noise all the way, certainly from fixes for the ACA up to Medicare for All. At the end of the day, I think even within the Democratic caucus, they'll probably not take on Medicare for All as an imperative for themselves. And if they do, let's look at what happened 8 years ago. We had a Democratic supermajority, and they could barely get Obamacare passed through the Byrd rule.